So I'm Adam Weston, Executive Director with Genesis Research Group, focused on our access and pricing team. So today we'll be looking at two high-profile case studies in the Alzheimer's disease space. At GRG, we offer a range of solutions across real-world evidence, HEOR, market access, and pricing. This will be more content-focused, but if you do have any questions about our services, please come and find me afterwards. We're also in booth 64 downstairs. So this is our agenda for the next 15 minutes. Our core objective is really to show how a more data-driven, evidence-based pricing strategy can inform smarter launch decisions. We're using Aduhelm and Leqembi as cautionary tales and success stories, and applying lessons learned across global markets, even though these examples are US focused. So I'd like to start by talking about why evidence-based pricing matters in the first place. So from the start of my career, one of the things I was most attracted to in this industry was what a difficult problem life sciences innovation is, how hard it is to commercialize a therapy and sustain that over time. I think it's very interesting to compare and contrast life sciences with technology. So in the technology space, we have something called Moore's Law that looks at the relationship between research dollars, time, with computer processor power. And we actually see a log linear relationship every decade in terms of processor speed. In life sciences, we actually have the reverse phenomenon. So considering the cost and the barrier to entry of research and development, the number of new drugs per $1 billion of research dollars spent has actually decreased over time since the 50s. So this is a difficult problem. Pricing isn't just about recouping costs or chasing return on investment. It's really fundamental to the viability of future research and development. But on the flip side, we also have to accept that for payers, they have to operate with fixed budgets, often constrained budgets, and they demand robust evidence to justify premium pricing and cover new therapies. And this push and pull dynamic, this almost yin-yang dynamic here, is exactly what evidence-based pricing is attempting to address. So I'd like to look at three core methodologies that we would use when developing strategic pricing recommendations. So from debates I witnessed early on in my career, there was a lot of discussion about, is strategic pricing an art or is it a science? Is there maybe more than one right answer to the problem? And now I would argue, I think once you break down the problem step by step, it's actually much more of a science. And when you apply a data-driven approach, a data-driven mindset to these three methodologies, there is one right answer at the end. The first one is analog landscape analysis, and this might sound very simple and basic, but it is a very powerful methodology given that we have access to decades of real-world data on pricing and HTA decisions. It's really all about systematically looking at competitor data, historical pricing trends, prior HTA decisions. We might look within the indication at direct competitors to a product, or we could look more broadly. So we might think about criteria that products share with the product we're interested in to try and identify other analogues in other therapy areas. And it could be an exhaustive search given that we have decades of data available. But what does this get us? This is more of a baseline context in our pricing strategy. It gives us baseline context about what prices have been accepted in the past. It's by no means a guarantee, but it does serve as a framework for further methodologies. Next is willingness to pay. So at GRG, we use both the Van Westendorp and Gabor-Granger semi-quantitative pricing methodologies with payers. So we use these via our RPR online survey platform. It's also possible to do them through other methodologies like IDIs. We found that this is reliable with at least 4 to 5 payers per market. So this is cost effective. It is repeatable throughout a product's early life cycle. And this gets us a real-world validation of how payers react to incremental price increases, so showing us a relationship between prices and what payers are willing to cover, considering a TPP, considering budget impact constraints. The next one is economically justified pricing, or EJP. So this is a framework that really goes beyond cost per quality as a basic calculation of price. So it might consider things like long-term cost offsets, and in an indication where you have high costs of hospitalization, surgeries, transplants, or productivity gains, societal benefits, or even things like reduced caregiver burden or other indirect costs. We've also seen examples where manufacturers have leveraged arguments around public health benefits. So interesting to look back at some of the COVID vaccines, and part of their economic value proposition was returning people to work and enabling economic reopening. The term EJP is relatively new, but it does have quite deep roots in some of the historical examples of pricing. So Sovaldi in hepatitis C did launch with a price and a value proposition on the basis that it would reduce the risk of needing a liver transplant. So there is quite significant roots in historical examples. Now, let's apply this to a real-world scenario. And I think Alzheimer's disease is a very interesting example because historically we've had generic, symptomatic, low-cost therapies that give us a very low analog price benchmark. And whenever we've done willingness to pay research looking at Alzheimer's disease assets, the responses we've got back from payers have always been clouded by their budget impact concerns. But when you apply an EJP lens to the problem, we see an area where there is significant quality of life impact, not just on the patient, but their family or their caregivers, as well as huge indirect costs like social care, institutionalization, and caregiver burden. So the first disease-modifying therapy that launched for Alzheimer's disease was Aduhelm. So this launched in 2021 through the FDA's accelerated approval pathway. It launched with amyloid reduction data, which was quite controversial given the clinical benefit based on the cognitive endpoints came across 2 trials and was unclear at launch. It did launch at a price of $56,000 per year in the US, which was a big gamble considering the evidence they had available. And without strong EJP arguments, without strong cost effectiveness arguments, it did face a lot of problems. There was significant payer backlash. So we saw private and public payers being very quick to impose coverage restrictions. There were accusations of overspending, overpricing, as well as significant public attention on the manufacturer. Ultimately, they dropped the price. So they dropped to, I believe, $28,000 per year on the basis that they wanted to improve patient access, but it felt very reactive and not a strategic pricing decision. The lessons learned with Aduhelm are really that a high price without transparent, data-backed rationale is a fast-track way to lose stakeholder trust, and you need strong evidence, both clinical and economic, to justify a price premium. Now, it's very interesting to compare and contrast this example with Leqembi, the second disease-modifying therapy in Alzheimer's disease. So this had much more robust evidence of cognitive benefit, so payers already saw it as a much more robust evidence package. We also saw much more proactive EJP messaging from the manufacturer. So we did see the manufacturer calculate an estimated societal value, considering things like the quality gain from the therapy, as well as direct and indirect costs. And they actually priced significantly below this threshold. So their price was lower than their estimated value to society, really telling payers the message that we understand your budget impact concerns, and we have tried to base our price on real-world justifiable cost offsets. This is really the approach that secures more trust with stakeholders. We did see from the start much better coverage compared to Aduhelm. Many plans were offering broader coverage at a much quicker rate. And we also saw much faster acceptance by CMS, which is the main payer body covering this demographic of patients. So this slide just goes into a bit more detail about exactly how the manufacturer calculated this annual per patient value. So it did consider an individual patient level simulation, and that was based on data from the clinical trial. Some of the inputs they considered were the quality gain, both in terms of direct benefits to the patient as well as the caregiver, as well as justifying a cost per quality threshold of $200,000 based on the level of unmet need and disease burden in Alzheimer's disease. And on top of that, they considered direct and indirect costs. So this was both medical, non-medical costs, as well as monetary value that was assigned for caregiver activities. It is possible to debate the exact cost per quality threshold that would be appropriate here. It's also possible to debate were these appropriate magnitudes of direct and indirect costs, but the main takeaway here is that this was a transparent pricing model, and this is really the hallmark of evidence-based pricing. It's not so much a magic bullet, but it's more of a formula that can be discussed rationally with payers rather than a top-down price that's put in front of payers. So moving on from Alzheimer's disease, how do we generalize some of these lessons? First, I think it's very interesting to think about, so these were two US-focused examples. Aduhelm has now been withdrawn, Leqembi will be launching in EU markets shortly. So what is different for ex-US markets compared to the US? The first piece is really about cross-country variation. So every country will differ in terms of their core value drivers, the structure of their HTA system, as well as perhaps the magnitude of cost offset they're willing to consider, maybe adjustment for their economy. Thinking forward to the EU JCA as well, it would be very interesting to see whether there is a more standardized approach for manufacturers assessing and presenting data on intangible benefits like societal or productivity gains, and maybe a more standardized approach by payers to consider those within their pricing framework. I think looking at some of these markets as well and thinking about openness to performance-based or risk-sharing contracts, it will be very interesting to see whether payers are interested in managed entry agreements that perhaps consider an EJP claim as the key metric for success. Another lesson in EJP is pick your battles. So there may well be situations where an EJP-like approach is more appropriate. It could be more appropriate for therapies that have transformational clinical benefit at launch, the first-in-class or the best-in-class therapies. It could also be more appropriate in indications where we have significant long-term cost offset. So perhaps chronic therapies where there is ongoing hospitalization that could be saved, or indications where there is a clear gain in terms of productivity or disability. I think situations where it may well be less appropriate in many markets, so Me Too products or commodity disease areas, if a therapy is only demonstrating a marginal benefit over standard of care, payers are much more likely to see economic differentiation through standard discounting and contracting models. And similar situations where we have high uncertainty in terms of clinical evidence, economic evidence, if the pivotal data are inconclusive, maybe don't include the right endpoints for payers, it may be much harder to make a case for an EJP-like price. And finally, just a couple of words about GRG. So we support across all three of the pricing methodologies I presented. We also offer a unified offering for EJP, so anything from evidence strategy development, economic modeling, to testing assumptions with stakeholders, testing EJP narratives through our RPR primary research platform. So I think in interest of time, I'll probably stop there, but I would love to take some questions if anyone has questions.
Thank you very much.